What is up, guys? Doug Polk here, and we're back for another episode of Poker Hands, this time from Vancouver. Today we're going to be looking at a Phil Ivey vs. Tom Dwan classic hand. You've probably seen it before. It's one of the most well-known hands from high-stakes poker, involving Tom Dwan squeezing out of the big one with 9 of spades and Ivey flopping the nut flush draw. But before I tell you too much, let's go ahead and roll the clip.
Could beat him in the pot. Call.
Phil Ivey has over $1 million now. Phil Ivey could actually have a hamburger and have enough money to pay off his $1 million bet with Dwan. He could actually have a whole barbecue right now if he wants.
Punish the Unabomber.
I'm easily punishable. There's many weaknesses in my game that people can exploit. You can ask Durrrr about them. He'll give you the list.
When's Barry getting here?
You might have to pay him something.
What's it? 30 what?
39.
Respect.
Durrrr is the last one. We're going to find out about the respect card right now. This is the
Here it
moment.
comes, 40,000.
From Durrrr, you don't know what to expect at any time in your life. It's total wild card madness game with Durrrr.
There is about 18,000 out there already. Both Phil and Antonio are goading Dwan into raising here, hoping that he doesn't. But he does.
And enter the wild card madness card. That's a 25. I don't even have one of those. He goes right to the exploit me. He knows that I have to give up 5 chips to call. 5 instead of just 1.
A cool 25,000 raise with 8, 9 of spades.
Should do 100 more.
100 more. You made it 39.
He's the best. He's just torturing me. So when I try and get in with 1 chip, he puts in 2. Durrrr might be the best.
So it's a 1 blue chip?
Yeah.
Ellie's big winner. He might take a shot.
1 blue chip. A lot of people at home call it a 1 blue chip.
Just 1 blue chip.
Worst lay down I ever make in my life.
That's the math of the hand. If I just called there instead of raising, we're likely to have 4 colors.
See if Mr. Ivey puts in that blue chip. Nope, it's 5 white chips.
It looks quite baller with Ivey's stacks of money and chips. It's most baller.
So our hand begins at 400, 800 blinds with a $200 ante. We're also playing 6-handed, so the ante is a little bit smaller than you might see in some of the other ante pots, which is important. You should definitely take that into consideration when thinking about what kind of hands I want to open, re-raise, or call, because your direct odds are a bit worse. Esfandiari folds under the gun, and then Laak elects to open it up to 3,900 with ace-9 off. Now, I would say if this was a normal game, out of the hijack, this is a little bit too loose of an open, but with an ante and an ace, I have no problem with this open whatsoever. It is on the loose side, and given how deep a lot of the players are playing, it might not be as good in this particular game because you're much less likely to steal the blinds. This play is much better in tight lineups where you're hoping to take down the blinds and antes. Particularly with players like Phil Ivey on the button or Tom Dwan the big blind, I think you're much more likely to see some action. So I don't really mind either way pre-flop here, but I might fold given this lineup. After he decides to open it up to 3,900, Elezra comes along in the cutoff with ace-7 of clubs. Definitely reasonable, although I probably lean more towards re-raising because it's not quite strong enough to be able to call. But call is certainly fine. I think as long as you're playing this hand a decent amount, you're playing the right strategy. Ivey then calls in the button with ace-6 suited. Here, both options are totally fine. Call makes some sense, raise makes some sense. As long as he's playing his hand as well, this is a fine play. Now, Daniel Negreanu decides to come into the pot from the small blind, calling an almost 5 big blind raise with Jack-3 suited out of the small blind. This play, getting a little bit dicey. I really doubt that out of position in a 5-way pot, particularly deep like this hand's going to have the value to be able to play pre-flop. I think Negreanu needs to use a little bit more pre-flop discipline and stick to some stronger holdings when facing opens in the blinds. Next up is Tom Dwan, always ready to fire off some bullets and put in a re-raise, and he elects to re-raise with 9-8 suited pre-flop in the big blind. I think that re-raising 9-8 suited, or really any suited connector in No Limit Hold'em, is generally a winning play. You get to isolate individual opponents, possibly take the pot down pre-flop, and then also disguise some of your stronger holdings like aces, kings, and queens, or rather I should say balance some of your stronger holdings like aces, kings, and queens by giving you the ability to hit straights and flushes, etc. So I'm okay with this play. However, the problem is if you're going to always squeeze with hands like 9-8 suited, then players can 4-bet you very effectively. I also have a little bit of a problem with the size. He's decided to go something like 36 big blinds over this open and then all these calls. And while it isn't open to 5 blinds, I think this is simply too many blinds. When you get 4-bet or people call, you're going to lose way too many blinds relative to what you're trying to win. Now, there are 3 calls and everyone's playing kind of loose, so this makes this play much better. Overall, I would say this is a winning play, but be careful with it because if you do this too much, you're going to have way too many bluffs. After raising here, Laak has a very clear fold, and he decides to do so. Elezra, pretty close decision, but I think fold is the correct one. And now Ivey definitely has the most reasonable situation to flat. You're in position, you're absurdly deep, and maybe this goes back to why Dwan chose the size to begin with, and you're going to have, you know, a lot of equity against a big blind re-raise range. If they're using a lot of your connectors, you might even be close to flipping. So calling here in Ivey's shoes, definitely a reasonable play and a Negreanu fold. So actually, to be honest with you, I'm okay with basically every decision that was made here pre-flop with the exception of calling 5 big blinds out of the small blind with Jack 3 suited. Let's see what the flop is.
Dwan misses. Phil Ivey's got a huge draw, nut flush draw, and an inside straight draw. A little $45,800 continuation bet. Ivey is analyzing the hand. It's very possible that Tom Dwan has a set. He raised $25,000 before the flop. He knows he's not going to get Tom Dwan to lay down a hand like ace-king or aces.
How much you start this hand with, Durrrr?
About 750.
But he does have a big draw, and he is playing against Tom Dwan. He might decide to gamble and raise. He just calls.
So the flop comes king, queen, 10 with 2 diamonds. Phil Ivey flops the nut flush draw and a gut shot, and Tom Dwan only flops a gut shot to the lower end of the straight, and no backdoor flush draw to help him along. And now we have to think about both of their ranges. What kinds of hands can they both have, and what should they be doing? Let's go ahead and start with Tom Dwan. So Dwan's going to be able to have hands like kings, queens, tens, ace-jack suited. These are all reasonable holdings. Ace-jack off should generally be flatting pre-flop, but also could be an okay hand to re-raise. The problem with re-raising a pre-flop is if you 3-bet pre-flop and get 4-bet, you're in a very tough situation. So you usually want to elect to call to avoid that scenario. So he has plenty of hands he can bet here for value. Well, what kinds of hands can he want to bluff with? Well, he might have a few hands like a couple suited aces, although again, those might be more reasonable to flat pre. And then some suit connectors like 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, etc. Of different types of suits. So what types of hands should he be bluffing the flop with? And I think really the only hands that make much sense are a few of his suited aces, depending on which ones he wants to 3-bet pre-flop, and then hands like 9-8 suited with a gutter, and hands like 8-7 of diamonds or clubs. Other than that, there really aren't many hands he can bluff with, and he will definitely have plenty of value. At least ace-jack suited, aces, kings, queens, tens. Those could all be very easily in this range. Now, if he does have aces or ace-king, I generally prefer to check the flop. It could be okay to bet flop and check turn, but those are certainly not hands that want to go 3 streets for value. You have to remember, when you're playing this deep, they're playing something along the lines of 1,000 blinds deep, maybe a little bit less than that, 950 blinds deep. It becomes very important to put more of your hands into specific scenarios, or into specific lines. So maybe he wants to bet everything on the flop and then go from there. Because there's really only a couple hands that really don't want to bet the flop. And I think the hands that come to mind are a hand like ace, queen, or jacks. If you bet those hands on the flop and your opponent continues, you're likely going to be behind a lot of their range. Additionally, if you get raised, you are in a very bad situation, particularly with ace, queen. So it could be okay to decide to bet everything on the flop and then go from there. Dwan elects to bet a size of about 46,000 with this hand, which is a very reasonable size, and I like his selection with this hand as a bluff. Now let's talk about Phil Ivey's decision on the button here with ace-6 of diamonds. On king queen 10 against the 3-better, he's really not going to have hands that can beat any of the value hands I listed, being kings, queens, 10s, or ace-jack suited, unless he has specifically ace-jack. And realistically, I think more likely ace-jack suited. While ace-jack off could call the open, calling the 3-bet when it's this large and you're this deep, when you don't even really have the ability to play different flush draws, it's going to make your hand a lot worse. So you're going to want to choose hands that are more like ace-6 suited, 10-9 suited, and hands that make sets, etc., over hands like ace-jack that can be easily dominated by ace-king, ace-queen, and be very far behind hands like aces through 10s, particularly aces through jacks. So, when Dwan bets the flop, and Ivey either has a very strong hand, the nuts, or more middling hands like ace-king is not really very reasonable, but king-jack, queen-jack, 10-9 suited, maybe even a hand like ace-10 suited, maybe some hands like ace-6 of clubs, etc. When he has these holdings, he's going to want to call. So, it makes sense for Phil Ivey to not raise at any point in this hand until the river, including ace-jack. And I think that's actually a really important point if I want to take one thing away from this hand, or if you guys want to take one thing away from this hand. In situations where one player has a lot of good hands and the other player only has one good hand, but it is the nuts, you generally don't want to raise any hands. Because by raising your good hands, what happens to your calls? You know, Dwan's going to play this spot very aggressively when you call. He's going to barrel a lot of runouts. So if you raise ace-jack on the flop, you take away his ability to bluff with an air ball, like let's say 9-8 of spades, and then you leave your hands that are calling to be too weak. So this is a pretty good situation for Phil Ivey to never raise any hands and elect to call and play the turn. Let's see what the turn is.
3 of spades on the turn. About as blank as you can get. 162,000 in the pot already. The man with 9 high bets 123-2. Phil Ivey has a big decision now. He feels he's behind and is trying to figure out if he can get paid off if he makes his hand. If a diamond comes, can he get any money out of Dwan? If a jack comes, is he just going to split the pot? He decides to call.
So Phil Ivey calls and the turn comes the 3 of spades. A total brick. Now Dwan once again is faced with another decision, kind of like with the flop. What hands do I want to bluff? And this is another important point to take away from in poker. You don't always want to bluff all the time with all your bluffs. You want to pick your bluffs out wisely. Now, what I think here on the turn is Dwan should decide, does he 3-bet suited aces pre-flop or not? Because if he can have a hand like ace-6 of spades, or ace-9 of spades, or ace-2 of spades, those hands are much better bluffs to want to go 3 streets with. Now, why am I talking about 3 streets when we're still on the turn? Because when you 3-bet a hand like, let's say, 9-8 of diamonds, that hand is not very good to go 3 streets. If you compare them, when you have diamonds yourself, you take away Phil Ivey's ability to have a flush draw that bricks and has to fold. So generally speaking, you want to have some bluffs bet the flop, some draws bet 2, and some hands that don't block your opponent's draws to bet 3. So when I'm selecting a hand like 9-8 of spades here on the turn, I might do that if I decide that I don't have some of those suited ace hands in my range. Thinks he's having a nightmare. If I don't have some of those suited hands in my range. So, Dwan's bet in the turn here I think is fine. I'm okay with this strategy, and really when he has this specific hand, he's announcing with his strategy, I'm going to fire the river because I have other hands that I want to not bluff with that his opponent could have. Back over to Phil Ivey. Phil Ivey has a very clear decision. This is a call on the turn. There's no doubt about that. He has a gut shot to the nuts, some showdown value, although not much, and also flush draw to the nuts. And particularly when you're this deep, if Dwan does have a hand like kings, queens, tens, or ace-jack himself, it's going to be very hard for Dwan to get away from a river that completes the flush. So his call on the turn here, while he might not have direct odds against a lot of the strong hands, Dwan occasionally giving up, him getting value when he gets there, him possibly being able to show down versus some hands, maybe on a 6 or an ace, which I guess really includes Dwan giving up, and then potentially the ability to bluff on some runouts, like let's say a 9, all make this a very good opportunity for Phil Ivey to continue to call. And again, going back to the flop, we're just not going to have any raises here on the turn. So let's play the river.
Ivey makes a pair of 6s on the river. Misses the flush, misses the straight. There's $408,700 out there. It's not like Tom Dwan to give up. This is the first time all season that the table's been completely quiet. Even Phil, Laak, and Antonio are quiet. He is loading the gun. He fires. 268,200.
How much is that and how much do you have left?
How about 280 left?
Dwan's voice was a little shaky there. He did not want to hear any inquiries from Phil Ivey. Can't expect Phil Laak to be quiet forever.
$258 2. 268.
You can see that Phil Ivey is not showboating. He is seriously contemplating a call here with a pair of 6s.
Wow. Wait till you see how long. Wait till y'all see what I have that I'm taking this long. I'm not gonna,
I think
you're
I
not
know
gonna
what it
believe
is.
this one. No, you don't.
Yeah, I think I do.
This is gonna be the sickest call of all time.
Dwan really looks nervous. What Phil Ivey's trying to decide is he really nervous or is he acting nervous? The truth is, he is really nervous.
Okay, let's see. Let's think about this a little bit.
Tom Dwan is starting to gulp now. The excitement is overwhelming to Ellie.
Sorry.
He only does for a minute. Antonio's like, he's
Sorry,
sleeping.
this is not. I don't usually take this
No,
long.
no, I don't. No one cares, Ivy. You can take till the.
It's 500,000 in the pot. You want us to tell you anything? Yeah. 500 in the middle. Four something.
Go back to sleep, kid.
Let's go back to bed.
Dwan looks worse.
Can't be nothing. Except for that.
Can't be nothing except what Tom Dwan has.
Okay.
Oh, that one hurt.
How much
God,
that?
my
think he's
eyes
bluffing.
hurt so
So then give him 5,000 if you can't show your ace high or better.
The river comes in offsuit 6, and Phil Ivey is obviously tilted with the way things have gone. Dwan now elects to fire 268,000 here on the river, and Ivey has a pair of 6s. To give Ivey a little bit of credit, he really wants to call and feels that Tom Dwan is bluffing here. So we've kind of already talked about Tom's bet on the turn, and I like this bet in the river if he doesn't have some of those better hands to bluff with that we already talked about. So I'm cool with what Tom Dwan's trying to do here. When Phil Ivey faces this bet, even though he really does think Tom Dwan is bluffing, sometimes you just have to let it go. Having the ace of diamonds is a pretty bad card in case Tom decided to bluff with the ace x of diamonds. And really, you don't want to have a diamond at all. What if Tom had 7-6 of diamonds? He might decide to fire this river. But now he can't, because you have the 6 of diamonds. In fact, if there's any hand to fold here on the river, it's probably exactly this hand. Now, I want to talk about something on this river that Ivey almost seemed like to think about at first, then decided not to do. I want to talk about raising the river, because I think raising the river is a pretty sick play. I don't like it with with ace 6, because you don't block a jack, and I think it's really important in spots like this when you're going to run a big bluff that you have a jack in your hand. If Phil Ivey decided he didn't want to re-raise Phil Laak pre-flop with pocket jacks, which against someone like Phil Laak, who tends to be on the tighter side, although it does come and go, if he can have jacks here, that would be an amazing hand to turn to a bluff on the river, because now the chance that Tom Dwan has ace-jack suited is cut straight up in half. However, if you're not going to have jacks pre because you're re-raising that hand, which is again probably the better strategy, then you're going to need to pick a hand. And I think that I would like to use a pick a hand that's not quite good enough to call. So I think Ivey should jam on this river when he has king-jack suited and ace-jack suited, so that he has some bluffs with a jack in them, and also some value with ace-jack. Now, I know there tends to be a lot of people in these YouTube videos, when they leave comments, they're like, oh yeah, you're going to bluff king-jack? Let's see you do it for that much money. And for those people, I guess you must have missed me trying to bluff in last week's episode. But besides the point, I know this is a lot of money, and when you get snapped off, it does suck. But let's think about pre-flop. Ace-jack re-raising out of the big blind doesn't really make that much sense. And additionally, if Dwan has a hand like kings or queens or tens, he's going to have a very difficult scenario. What did he do with his set there? Ivey's basically saying he has jack-9 suited or ace-jack suited, which are both reasonable holdings for him to have given the action. With ace-6, you have a very easy fold. You have bad removal, and it's basically the worst hand you can have here. So what is the worst hand that Ivey should call here? I think generally speaking, that's about 2 pair. Because let's say you have a hand like king-queen. Now Tom Dwan's way less likely to have a hand like kings or queens himself. So there's a big difference between having king-queen or having just a king or just a queen, in terms of how many hands their opponent can have that are value betting. That makes your opponent, again, much more likely to be bluffing, and as we know from a lot of these videos, Tom Dwan definitely enjoys his bluff. So even though this is tilting for Ivey, and like you can see the wheels turning as he tanks on the river, he made the right decision with a fold, and frankly, this is probably the first hand on poker hands that I've reviewed where I've really actually been behind almost every decision made in the entire hand. This was a well-played hand between 2 great players that ended up with someone getting bluffed. And sometimes you get bluffed and it's the right play, but what you need to take away from that is understanding the way to play your range, understanding more about your opponent, and figuring out in the future what you're going to do to try and counter their strategy. All right, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. That's going to do it for me, and I'll see you next time on Poker Hands. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel so you can get updates for more from Poker Hands. Was I happy with the fact that Antonius is staring me down from seriously 6 inches away from me while I'm trying to run a 300k bluff on him on the river? No, that's a very uncomfortable situation. And I just tried to stay focused on the board, and I knew in my head, I knew in my heart, that if I was playing online, I would do this